All right. Um, so, we have two lectures on Chinese garden, and this is the first one. So this one we focus on the so-called private garden, and we will focus especially on a region in China that had produced a large number of good quality private garden in the late imperial period. By late imperial, we refer to the last two dynasties of the Ming and the Qing period, roughly from the 14th century to the early 20th century. So this period also correspond to the period in Western history since the Renaissance, to the rise of modernism in architecture. So it might or might not be a coincidence. I don't think that it is a coincidence. I think the world is very connected, and what happened in a small corner of the world is related to the global event. So it's all kind of interconnected. They are all related. So this period, while the political center of China was in the north, the capital, imperial capital, is in the city of Beijing in the north. The economic center is in the Yangtze Delta area. That is the area around today's Shanghai. But in the Ming and Qing dynasty, Shanghai was a small kind of county level city. The real metropolitan, real commercial city was the city of Suzhou in that area. So this is the place where, for example, a imperial official working in Beijing would like to retire in. So after they retire from their official posts, a lot of them chose this area and Suzhou as a place to spend the rest of their life. So the city was located in a place where transportation system intersect in this area. It is close to the Yangtze River, which was a major east-west artery for transportation. It was also very close to the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal was a major north-south, excuse me, major north-south waterway. So it is like the city was located at a very key spot in terms of communication and transportation. It was also very close to a very big lake called the Lake Tai. And the area was wet, plenty of rainwater, and also a lot of rivers, lakes, the canal. So all those provide a material base for the construction of garden, because the Chinese garden, known as the landscape garden, there are some key elements. Two of the most important element in Chinese garden is water and a mountain. So the Chinese garden is also known as landscape garden, and in Chinese that is called the Shanshui Yuan. And Shanshui means mountain and water. So the very name of the garden indicate the key element. And Suzhou is located in a place, we have rich resource for the construction of garden. So the private garden are, attachment to a residence. This is the map for the city of Suzhou. So here, the map is interesting compared to some other, maps of ancient Chinese city from the imperial period. This map delineate both the road system and the canal system. So you might be able to notice, there are black lines and white lines. Those black lines indicate road, and the white lines indicate waterways. So we have the waterways very often parallel the street and avenues because water element is very important in this city. And the city is also sometimes known as the Oriental Venice, like Venice, the canal system is just as important as the road system. Well, maybe more important than the road system for transportation. So it's Suzhou. And those water not only provide a sewage system, water supply system, but also feed water to the garden. And this is a very tiny, small garden. It is not famous at all, but it represents a typical private garden in a household. So the garden is located on the east side of a residential compound, right? So this is the residential courtyards with the buildings and with its access. So the architecture for the house has a strong north-south axis. And then the garden is attached to it, accessible from the household, and it's tiny. So this is the more detailed plan just for the garden. And you can see, even in this small garden, not famous at all, it represents a lot of common features for Chinese garden. Well, just give you a sense of the scale. This, you might not be able to see it very clearly, but this is a 5 meter. 5 meter, about 15, 16 feet. So it is roughly, 10 meters square, that kind of scale. Well, maybe 12, 12 meter square. It's not very big at all. About 40 feet square. So it's the size of a, it is the size of a middle-sized classroom on Northeastern campus. Right? It's not very big for a garden. It is not very big at all, just 40 feet square. But in this tiny little garden, it has those common features for Chinese garden that we will look in more detail in the later, more famous garden. Its entrance is usually from the house, a small entrance, accessible from the courtyard that is located. In this case, it is located to the west of this garden. And the entrance is usually very small. And one, go through a relatively small and narrow passage to find the entrance to the garden. In terms of the space, space are relatively more free, has kind of not limited by strong axis. So the space was arranged to avoid axiality, and elements were arranged usually deliberately avoiding symmetry. So compared to the residential part where there is an axis, there are symmetries, and architecture were arranged in straight line, all those rectangle squares for the courtyard and house. In the garden, you barely find one single straight line. Everything is curved. So this little pond in the middle, it's only about 15 feet across, so a tiny little pond, but the boundaries are curved, and those curved borders allows the water surface to kind of penetrate into the other garden elements, have a more closely interrelated connection with the surrounding areas. So the space is asymmetrical without axiality, and it also has kind of larger open space in the middle, because there's a lake, there's a water body in the middle. And this is always the case for any kind of Chinese garden. In the center, it is almost always a water surface to create a large space. And then the surrounding areas were divided into smaller spaces. So there are kind of artificial hills, sometimes also known as the scholars' rocks, but piled up to represent mountain. And so they define those smaller spaces. So you have that contrast between a large central space and those more divided surrounding areas. And even in this tiny little garden, those spatial features are also kind of a, that kind of spatial contrast was still being attempted. So I mentioned a little bit about the elements. So there are basically two elements, the natural element and the constructed element. So there's nature, there's building. And in the garden, of course, nature is the main character. Buildings are surrounded by nature. And the most important elements for nature is, as I mentioned, mountain and water. So those are, not necessarily a full-size mountain, and in this kind of small garden, it is impossible for a real mountain to appear here, but there are elements to arrange representing mountain, like the Scholar's Rock, or some small hills consist of a earth mound and with some, rocks and plants covering the surface. The connections among those elements are never straightforward, as in the Confucian style palace. So they are like the border of the water surface. They are curved and zigzag to create those indirect connection. And the passage within the garden are also in the same form, kind of curved and zigzagged, and linking those elements kind of in a indirect way. And those passages are often hidden behind a tree and behind a rock. So never just, exposed and revealed directly, as what we have observed in the palatial style architecture. And finally, in garden, the views, garden is for pleasure, is for enjoyment of sceneries and views. So those view design is really a key element. So the kind of a more organic organization allows the design and arrangement of a variety of views. So when you have an axis, when you have symmetry, the views are relatively monotonous, right? So at different location along the axis, the views are pretty much the same. Just think about the Forbidden City. If you are walking along the central axis in different courtyard, the scale might be different, but the view you get are pretty much the same. You have a central building and you have symmetrical accompanying buildings on the two sides. No matter whether you are standing in front of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, or you are standing in front of the Hall of Heavenly Purity, or you are standing in front of a central building in a smaller courtyard on the side in the Forbidden City. So the views are pretty much the same, but that is avoided in the garden design. The views were meant to be varied, and that lack of symmetry and axiality provide opportunity to create more diversified views. So these are the kind of key elements in garden, and in the Suzhou garden, representing the Jiangnan style Chinese garden, especially. So that previous one is a small garden, and those more famous Suzhou garden are usually bigger, like this one. This is a bigger garden, but it still has all those characteristics. It is an attachment to a big house, and in this case, it's a bigger house. And it used to belong to just one family, but later it was divided into three, and so it has a complicated history. Sometimes some parts are united, bought by one family again, etc. and etc. So there's a complicated history for this for this specific garden. This is called the Zhuozheng Yuan. While the previous private garden is less than an acre, and this one is about 300 acres. So it's much bigger, but it is still an attachment to a house. And in this case, it's a very big house, but it has all those key elements, water surfaces, lack of symmetry and axiality, indirect connections, etc. and etc. Right? So we will focus on this garden to have a kind of a more in-depth analysis of the garden space and architecture in private garden. So it's called the Zhuozheng Yuan. Literally translated as the garden of unsuccessful politician. And as I mentioned, a lot of Suzhou gardens were built for retirement of an official that used to serve in the court in Beijing, and this is one of them. So it was first built by a minister in Beijing, and after he retired, he came to the city of Suzhou and built himself this garden. It was first built in the 16th century. 16th century, basically, the kind of a late Renaissance period in Europe. He named it Zhuozheng Yuan, or the Garden of Unsuccessful Politician. So that very title suggests the one of the key ideology behind the garden as a architectural typology in Chinese architecture. While the ideology behind imperial palace is to represent the power, to show authority using symmetry and axiality, and using hierarchy to express a power relationship in Confucianism. Garden, on the other hand, represent a very different ideology. Usually the garden was meant to suggest an idealized kind of a hermetic lifestyle. While the unsuccessful politician suggests that someone was tired of politics, tired of those court intrigues, so in the life of retirement, so he can be a simple farmer or a simple fisherman, away from those kind of away from politics, but living a hermetic life. And the idealized hermetic life had been a major theme in Chinese literature and art, Chinese painting. So very often you find those in landscape painting, fishermen and woodcutters in the mountain. So kind of delineating a more kind of Arcadian lifestyle. The garden is a physical representation of that kind of a utopian idea about a lifestyle without politics, without struggle, living a simple life, living like a hermit. And of course, for someone who can afford building a garden of this size, he must have, a lot of money and a lot of resource. But even for these well-to-do family, for this rich family, they still kind of build themselves something representing simpler life and pretending to be a simple farmer while surrounded by all those richness. And even the emperor, when they built their own imperial garden, this ideology was still there. This kind of a utopian ideal for a idealized Arcadian style life was still the major philosophy behind the garden design. So that's very different from palace, from ritual architecture, from or just from a common residence. So unsuccessful politician suggest that hermetic idealization, idealized hermetic life. So the residence in this case is in the southern part to the south of the garden. So the garden is attached to the north of the residence. And when it was first built for a single family, later it was divided. The garden was also divided. So it has multiple entrance for different household. But when it was first designed, the entrance is from the in the eastern central area, from that area. That is the entrance to the whole garden. And the entrance is very small. Okay. That entrance. And in the later reconstruction, that entrance is not only accessible from the back door of the residence, but also directly from the street, right? So this is a major street. So you can also go through this very small alley and directly reach the entrance, the gate to the garden. So on the left here we have a picture for the gate of the garden. So that alley is very narrow. It's only about 1.5 meter, 2 meter, that kind of narrow space. And it is also pretty dark. Space is narrow. So when you reach the space in front of the gate, in front of the entrance, that space in front of the door already appears more spacious, right? So this is a very important design strategy. So we know that the idea for a garden, especially for a private garden, is to represent full-scale mountain and full-scale water surfaces, lakes and rivers, etc., in a relatively confined, small backyard space. So how to make people feel a pile of rock is like a mountain, And a shallow pool of water is like a lake. How to make people feel that? Well, the strategy is to force people to go through a very small and a dark space, so that spatial contrast would make people feel the garden element bigger than the really is. This is actually the same strategy that we have experienced, in other architectural tradition as well. So, for example, in Pantheon in Rome, so before you go under the dome, you have to go through the entrance, and that entrance has lower ceiling and relatively dark space, and so that you can make a transition from under the dome of heaven into a space under an artificial dome of the architecture. So in order to appreciate the great size of the constructed dome, you have to go through something smaller. If you go directly from the dome of the sky into a artificial human constructed dome, you will never feel that dome is very big, because no dome is bigger than the sky, right? So you have to go through some kind of a architectural transition to give you a sense of what is a normal architectural space look like. And then the great size and the monumentality of the Pantheon can be appreciated. So in Western architecture, this is also quite common as well. So it is a very efficient way to create kind of architectural spatial drama through these contrast. It is also like in music, in order to make a sound powerful, you have to whisper in the few bars leading toward that. And then you have a big band at the end for the finale of a orchestra symphony. So it is the contrast, and that entrance is very important to create a contrast, to make people feel the spaciousness of the garden. That gate is called the Wastegate, right? It's like it's in the middle. It's like the position of someone's waist. It's the middle gate, basically, right? So there's a gate directly opening to the street. So from the gate, after that narrow and dark alley space, you see the bright light in the garden with trees and rocks. So, and that create an enticement for people to go in. So that light always draws people in. And so, and in this sense, there's, in addition to the contrast of, narrowness and spaciousness, there's also a contrast of the dark and the light. So every garden, just in the central open space area, there's always a major building, a dominating building. And so there's a central lake, And next to it, there is always a central building. So the garden was used for gathering, for having a party, for example. And in the late imperial China, those parties always are always kind of engaged with the literati activity, including, painting, calligraphy, antique appreciation, zither playing, the playing of guqin, that seventh string zither like instrument. That's a specifically a literati instrument, or playing chess. So these are called the four literati art. It included the qin, and that is the musical instrument. The qi, that is the chess, the Chinese chess, known better as the Go chess, and the calligraphy, and then painting, and sometimes theater as well, theatrical performance. So that is provided the central space for those literati activity, artistic activity, a platform facing the central lake that allow people to get a more panoramic view of the garden. That is a central space. After that dark alley, this central space with an open water surface and surrounded by, a building. So all those elements appeared pretty sizable, pretty big. So we are looking from the just after entering the garden and looking at that direction. After you entered and you go around the surrounding space and looking eastward toward that central building right there. And this is the central lake. The central building is known as a Ruoshu Tang. Tang is like a hall, and Ruoshu is, like a building in a wilderness. So a building in wilderness is called a shu. So again, the name of the buildings, just like the name of the garden, suggest a utopian idealization of a bucolic life of simple farmers. And when the garden was first built in the 16th century, the famous literati painter Wen Zhengming, who also served in the court in Beijing before he retired to the city of Suzhou, painted this garden. The garden was designed and built for Wen Zhengming's friend, Mr. Wang. So he painted the garden, and this is Wen Zhengming's painting. It's a album leaves. This is one of the many album leaves he created for the Zhuozhengyuan, the garden. And in Wen's painting, the central building appeared simpler than the current one that is still standing there. So probably in the 16th century, buildings are simpler. And in his painting, the roof appeared to be a thatched roof instead of a tiled roof. And it is not as closed as the current building. We don't know exactly how realistic Wen's painting is, whether this is the actual depiction of the 16th century building, central building in Zhuozhengyuan, or whether it is also an idealization. And in this case, the idealization is not to make it seems more luxurious, but to make it seem simpler, to be closer to the simple bucolic life of a hermit. We simply don't know because we have kind of limited sources for this actual 16th century garden. Garden is one of the most vulnerable architectural form for historical preservation, because a key element in garden is nature, and nature change, right? And so is garden building. So they change very often, and they also were not constructed precisely for permanence, especially under the Chinese garden philosophy of kind of the utopian simple life. Excuse me. This is the view for the opposite direction. This is looking toward the east of the garden. Standing on the west end, looking toward the east. The previous one is standing on the east end, looking toward the west. Island located in the middle of the lake. In fact, it is more like the water were created to surround the land. So the central land appeared to be some kind of island. This represent the Taoist ideology. In general, garden design is more connected with the philosophy of Taoism than Confucianism. According to Taoist mythology, there are 3 islands of immortals in the East Sea. And so achieving immortality was one of the major Taoist major purposes for Taoist practice in late imperial period. In the religious Taoism. So the island is a very important motif in garden design. So if the size allows, you always find some kind of island within the water surface. And in this case, this is a large size private garden, so it can afford having an island in the middle of the water surface. So looking toward that direction, you see the connection between the island and the land on the other side of the water surface. So here there are 2 bridges. Here we have one bridge. Here we have another bridge, right, connecting the island with the platforms and passage. So here we have these bridges, and this is the the island in the middle of the water. Usually, from the most of the angles, architecture appear to be hidden behind the trees and the natures. So here the main platform for the literati activity, and So that is hidden behind the trees, instead of unlike in the palace where a major facade was for appreciation, and in this case it is usually a corner of the building that is meant to be appreciated, and the rising eaves and columns are usually hidden behind the trees and behind other architectural elements. So architecture was meant to be appreciated very differently. In the garden, it was meant to be appreciated as part of nature, not meant to present a full face, full facade to a large space. So here we are standing on the island and looking south and looking at a small building. It was meant to represent a boat. It was meant to represent a boat. Although the reality is, it is just as solidly landed on Earth as any other building in the garden. But the special design of the roof was meant to represent a boat. And when people gather in this place, they are surrounded by water from all three directions. So it's protruding into the water. So it's on three sides of the building, there are water. So you can imagine you are, sitting or standing in a boat because you are surrounded by water from three sides. And this is also a place for making kind of historical association with those great literature about famous scholars, travel in a boat and experience all those great landscape in the Yangtze River that had a lot of history happened in the past. There were a lot of poems composed for those famous locations. And you can imagine when people gather here to appreciate a calligraphy, a piece of calligraphy, writing the famous poem, eulogizing the heroic event happened centuries before, and eternalized in those great literature. And that is the space for that kind of activity, right? So the appreciation of these literati garden obviously is not only scenery, but also history, and also kind of a historical allusion. And that is part of the enjoyment. So architecture was constructed to create a mental environment as well, to allow people to make those historical association. So in addition to the nature and sceneries, there were also plenty of message from literature, from history. And indeed, there are many inscriptions in the garden architecture, actually in any Chinese architecture. Very often you find a couplet on the column, and those couplets were also appreciated as great literature, great poetry poetic work, and they are pointing to the direction you should be imagining while you are, surrounded by this environment. So this is the boat-shaped building here. Now this picture, we are in this very kind of confined space. This is the end of the lake, the southern end of the lake, and it is also pretty narrow. And looking north, and looking at that bridge, kind of crossing this water and bridging the buildings on the two sides of this very narrow waterway. If you rely on your rational thinking to measure the space of this water, you will be surprised how small it is. Well, this is a building, right? This is the roof of a building. And this is a corridor above the bridge. So that is about the height of a one-story building, right? A one-story building is about like 10 feet, right? So that's about 10 feet. And that waterway is not much bigger than 10 feet. It's small. It's very small. It's probably like 15 feet, 20 feet at most, right? 20 feet at most. But then for a moment, you use your rational thinking to measure the space. But for the most time, when you are looking at a picture like this, and let me erase that. But for the most time, no one is measuring a photo. Just looking at this picture, you actually feel that space, that water is very big. It's much bigger than, say, 15 feet. Why is that? What happened? What is the trick to make you feel that it's bigger than it really is? Think about, if the the bank of the water surface is straight lined, it's geometric, you will immediately grasp the scale of that water surface, right? But once it is zigzagged, once it is curved, and the bank of the water is also dotted with rocks instead of just a straight line border, it gives you a very different reference of scale. So that is part of the reason. So it avoided that geometric shape that would allow you to measure it automatically. So when you see a geometric shape, you will automatically initiate that rational thinking of measuring the scale. But when it is organic, you won't do that. So that is one reason. Another reason, that zigzag and curve And also the lack of geometry make the water surface that seems belonging to a bigger water surfaces. So for example, when you are standing here and looking, when you are standing here, and looking at that direction, you don't see the source of the water. You just see the water kind of turned away to both sides. In that case, your imagination would perceive that water surface as if it belonged to a much bigger water surfaces. It does belong to a bigger water surfaces, but how large is that extension of this water? You don't know because you don't see. And when you don't see, you can imagine it might be a huge lake, right? So you don't see the end. It is small, but you don't see its border. And that would allow you to feel it is bigger because your imagination is activated. And finally, architecture also contributed to that. Architecture avoided straight line. Well, that the bridge is slightly curved up to avoid a straight line. When you have a straight line, you have a good sense of size and scale, and you can measure it immediately, mentally. But when it is bent, it is zigzagged, it added complexity, and that complexity would discourage that kind of rational measuring thing. And the roof is also curved, and that curve created a complicated shape. And it also minimized the scale because the scale is split and divided into smaller and more sections. And in that case, it makes the architecture look smaller than it is. And in this case, the architecture itself, it is not big at all. And then it is avoiding one dimension. It was divided into many, many dimensions to make it even more divided. And so the scale is broken down. Same is true for the relatively bigger building next to it. Everything is curved so that there's no large straight line. So if it is just one roof, then that line is going to look big. But that roof line is divided into curve and bend to break the scale down. And the architecture were also arranged asymmetrically. There's a roof here closer, and there's a roof more in distance, and then a linear horizontal element making the connection. So that asymmetry, kind of also helped to allow people to kind of perceive the water surface, the space as something richer and also bigger. In the 16th painting, Wen Zhengming painted a bridge of the same name, Xiao Fei Hong, the little flying rainbow, in a more simplistic fashion. So it is without a roof. But in Wen's painting, it seems to be located on a different location because it is linking, it seems like it is linking the Central Island area with the main gathering hall space. So that is different from the current location of the building with the same name, 小飞鸿, the little flying rainbow. Excuse me. This bridge is actually located on the same location as what is depicted in the 16th century painting, right? But in reality, 小飞鸿 is located crossing that water surface, and the actual bridge bridging the island and the gathering hall is this one. It actually looks similar to what Wen Zhengming depicted in the 16th century painting, 小飞鸿. So that's connecting this island and that gathering space with platform and a major hall. It's zigzagged. The zigzagged bridge has all the functionality to create an illusion of bigger scale, as I just analyzed in the previous slide. It has one additional function. That is, it prolonged the passage. So if you have a straight bridge, you will spend a shorter time to cross that water. But with zigzag, you must spend longer time to cross that water. And that, of course, helped to create a greater psychological feeling of space because of the time spent for crossing. Zigzag also forced visitor to make turns while walking through. So you are facing this direction on this section, and then you have to turn left to look at that direction when crossing that section of the bridge, and then turn again, right? So traveler within the garden are forced to make turns so that you must look at the garden from different angle. You must do that. So the space was designed to kind of guide your behavior, to make you make certain action, and that action is meant to guarantee that one have a full appreciation of the garden, looking at the garden from different perspective, from different angle, right? And that is very common in garden design, of course. No direct connection, no straightforward passage. It's always curved or zigzagged to prolong the time of traveling, to also force people to look at the garden from different perspectives. So here we are kind of standing on this ground and looking at a building also hidden behind the nature and other architectural element. And that building is called the Tower of Mountain Viewing. And it is that building. That building is called the Tower of Mountain Viewing. And we are looking at it from this direction. So in this slide, I wanted to highlight another very important designing strategy in Chinese garden. In order to create a large spatial feeling in a confined, limited space. Again, that distance was not that great at all. It is not that large a distance, not that far away. but it appeared far away. So again, if you actually measure the distance on the map, you will find, it is pretty close. But when you are standing there and when you are looking at this photo, you feel that building is very far away. So again, going back and forth, shifting your brain from back and forth between rational thinking and spontaneous perceiving. What happened here? So how did the designer achieve such a sense of spaciousness while he had only a very small distance to work with? The key is to divide the space without obstructing the views. So that is the key for making space looks bigger than it really is. So you can see that building. However, you cannot, it is not immediately reachable, right? So you can see it, but there's no direct passage allowing you to go straight to that. So it's unreachable from what you see, although you can see it. That created that psychological distance. You have to find a way, and that way is pretty long, right? So you need to go around and eventually reach it. The space in between is divided. So there is a bridge, for example, in the middle. So you feel there is a thing between you and that object you are looking at. And this column and this roof, added another layer of spatial division. And then, in addition, there are trees, added another layer, and there's the bank of the water surface, those rocks. So there's a lot of things going on between yourself and the targeted building. So even though in real physical distance, it is not that great, but because of the many layers in between and those divisions, spatial dividers in between, it created that kind of a difficulty of reaching it, and also the spatial division adding complexity to the layers of space created that feeling of farther distance. And also when the roof is hidden behind the trees, you also do not have a good sense of the actual scale of that building. So the curved roofs, all those things that break down the scale of the building, make the buildings look smaller. And when the building looks smaller, and you feel it is farther away as well. So that also helped to create an illusion of greater space, right? All those layers are added without totally blocking the building, and that is the key, right? So it created complexity and richness, but still allowing you to perceive that targeted object. So this is the building. When you get close, you see, it is a fairly big building. 2-story, so you can climb up to the 2nd story to see the surrounding area. And you don't actually see a mountain, so it's called the mountain viewing tower. A similar building depicted in the 16th century painting by Wen Zhengming shows a tower hidden behind the tree, like what we see in the previous slide. But he also painted a mountain just next to it. I should say that there's nothing like you can actually see in this garden, in the garden of Zhuo Zhengyuan. So that is totally imaginary, right? In another word, Wen Zhengming, when he was creating the painting for the Zhuo Zhengyuan garden, he was not realistically depicting what he see. He was depicting what one should see in their mind's eye, through their mind's eyes. So that's imagined. That is an imagination. It is almost suggesting that if you are standing inside this building or that building, you should imagine a mountain like that. And that is the whole point of private garden. You need to use your imagination, and your imagination, how you should imagine, is controlled by the design. The design is giving you direction. It's suggesting the direction, is trying to create an environment that allow you to successfully have an imagination of a greater wilderness in a confined backyard of a household. So those are all around the central lake area. And then there are many smaller courtyards and corners in the surrounding area. So you have a sense of large central space and those divided smaller side spaces. This is a pavilion called the Wuzhu Youju, which is right there. There's a small, kind of a, can be translated as hermetic dwelling in the kind of bamboo gravel, something like that. And that pavilion, in this slide, I wanted to highlight the characteristic of garden architecture. It's usually very open, and the roofs are curved more dramatically than other architecture, more exaggerated curves pointing upward, right? Like the wings of those flying birds. The doors are usually opened in to avoid those straight lines as well. And in this case, it has a circular opening. And those circular opening are called the moon gate. They are called the moon gate in the Chinese architectural vocabulary. And the circular outline of the moon gate work better with the garden environment. It breaks down the scale. It also create a more lively physical form, and it work better with the organic shape of trees and the zigzag banks of the water surfaces. So in this slide, I wanted to introduce another concept in garden design that is called view borrowing. View borrowing suggests that, in designing the garden, you must take into consideration the surrounding area. So if there's a famous landmark in the distant mountain, you should make sure to incorporate that landmark into the view of your backyard. In this case, there is a pagoda. You can see the pagoda. And the pagoda is outside the city of Suzhou. It was outside the Zhuozhengyuan. It is outside the city of Suzhou. But, architecture, when you are standing just beyond the entrance on the eastern end and looking to the west, there's no architecture in between, no big tree in between to block that view. So that pagoda in the distance is incorporated into the view of the garden. And that pagoda also makes reflections in the, in the water. So those are designed on site, I believe. It is very hard to have a good sense of how that design should appear on a drawing board. If you are just designing on a drawing board, that view borrowing won't happen. You don't have that kind of accurate measurement to make that successful. So on-site design is very important for garden architecture. It's more spontaneous, more experiential. Craftsman and the master of the house and the designer, often a painter, must be working on the site to tell, look, there's the pagoda is in that direction, so let's make the waterway curved this way or that way, and let's make that that roof lower and in that height to make that combination of the view, right? So that's experiential. That's on-site design. It's not designed just on a drawing board. Today we have kind of a computer assimilation, to build a 3D model on computer, if you want to see how the space worked with the surrounding environment. But, in the 16th century, there's nothing like that. So people must be on the site. And I should say today, even, when we have computer, we have all those, 3D modeling, we still need to be on site to have a sense of the place for a more successful design. So view borrowing, a very important element in garden design. Pavilions, I wanted to talk about a little bit about pavilion in Chinese garden. Pavilion is important. Pavilion called a ting in Chinese, and ting means stop. So pavilion in Chinese word, it means stop. So it should stop here. So when you see a pavilion, you should go there. You should stop there. Because pavilions are located at a location where you will see beautiful sceneries. And the windows in the pavilion are like picture frame, and from which you get a picture like in a Chinese painting, right? So this pavilion is located on a hill just next to the central gathering ground, just here. So it encouraged people to climb up and go there to get a view from those windows. It is also facing a large open ground, right? So the pavilion is here, and there's the large gathering ground here around the main hall. So it is also a target of view. It is part of a beautiful picture when you are standing near that gathering ground and looking that way. You see a beautiful picture, and that pavilion is part of that picture. And it is also the place where you should be standing to get a picture of the surrounding area. So pavilion in Chinese garden is both the origin and the target of an observing gaze. That is the significance of Chinese pavilion in the garden. And in the garden, there's a passage, kind of a passage that link all those key places. So if you follow the passage line, you might be able to connect, create a network of passages, right? Those small road. And those pavilions, in that sense, are like the stops on that passage. So they are the place where you should stop while you are traveling on that network of road, of passages. And the word literally means stop. The ting, that is the pavilion. So show you a picture of a small courtyard that is more enclosed. It is this little courtyard. So it's provide a kind of a studio for people to study in a quiet garden environment on the east side of the garden, called Haitang Chunwu, the spring pier of begonia tree. So it's a very small courtyard. And there's a corridor, and there's a building, and the whole courtyard is enclosed by wall. So I want to talk a little bit about the color of garden architecture. They are black and white, right? They are usually colorless without, those colorful painting. They are usually black and white, or the brown color of the aged wood. Because in garden, the main actors are the natural element, are the trees. So it is for the tree, flower to bloom, to demonstrate their colors. And architecture is providing a relatively blank background for the display of nature, right? So their color is black and white. Just like the windows are frames for the picture, the architecture are like the paper, and the nature are the brushwork for the painting. And architecture is the frame and the background for nature as the picture. And indeed, this is in the same courtyard. Now we are standing here and looking at the opposite side of the wall. And on that wall, this courtyard is so tiny, you can hardly see the detail in that plan. That's the opposite. That's the wall facing the building. and it is a perfect kind of a painting, right? And the wall is whitewashed to be like a paper, and we have the bamboo and rocks, etc., just like what you might see in a Chinese ink painting. So that's the eastern side. The western side belonged to a different family in the Qing dynasty. It also had its own main building. This one, it's called the Mandarin Duck Hall. It's called the Mandarin Duck Hall because it is a building with a pair of rooms. So the building is divided in the middle into half and half, entered from different doors, just like Mandarin duck that always float on a water surface in pair. The architecture is open, so all the doors are glazed when glass was available. Before glass was available, they were covered with translucent shells, those seashells, kind of in little pieces, like the Gothic rose window, but here, those seashells were shaped into very thin plate to cover a window so that the light can enter the interior. But then in the late 19th century, glass became available, so they were replaced with glass. So the interior is very bright. And this is the, looking at that direction, we are looking at the corridor just next to the wall. So this is a wall dividing the western half and eastern half of the garden. And just along that wall, there's a corridor. There's a corridor almost parallel to that wall. But the relationship is complicated. So it's not just a corridor parallel to the wall. From the shadow of the roof, you can tell the distance between the corridor and the wall are varied. Some places are narrower, some places are wider, and they are not parallel at all. The corridor kind of curved and created a diversified relationship with that wall. And that created richness. Otherwise, you won't have that interesting lighting effect, right? So you have that bright wall, and you have that diagonal shadows cast by that. It's because of the varied distance. And that is, of course, also part of the effort of avoiding symmetry, avoiding axiality. And that is very different from what we observed in the Forbidden City, representing the Confucian ideology. This is a reflection tower. It was meant to, its reflection in the water was meant to be appreciated. So here in this water surface. Again, that water surface is tiny. It's there. It's that narrow space, but with a symmetry with trees and all those hidden, hiding, all those strategy of hiding, it create a feeling of spaciousness. And this is a very famous pavilion located here. It is in the fan shape. The plan is in fan shape. The roof is in fan shape. And that window is also in fan shape, right? And this shows the diversity of pavilion. It also is a good example for on-site design, because there's a I don't know if you can see it or not. It's right here. There's a roof of a distant pavilion, and that pavilion is located there. Right, so there is a pavilion behind it, and this picture is not taken from that angle, but from a different angle. The roof of the distant pavilion would appear right here, can fit in that, and thus completed a combined roof looking of a fan-shaped lower part and a conical upper part, right? So you might be able to find some good picture on the internet that is taken from that angle. It won't be difficult to find a picture like that. So that is on-site design, all right? So you won't be able to do that if you are just drawing on the board without the help of computer. So experiential on-site design to achieve that. This is the interior of another building on the west side, kind of similar to the interior of the Mandarin Duck Hall. It's open, right? So I want to show you with this picture the openness and the brightness of the interior of this garden architecture. It was not meant to be closed up from the outside world. And here we have an inscription of the name of the building, and the inscription called Tower for Lingering to Listen, and is making reference to famous Chinese poetry and literature, and all those historical information are suggested here, like what I mentioned previously in the boat-shaped building, that literature, history is part of the garden appreciation in addition to the view. So there's a kind of a cultural element, very important for a full appreciation of Chinese garden. So, all right. So let's stop here, and we can look more briefly. So once we experience one garden in greater detail, the rest of the examples, I can just show you the picture, and you should be able to analyze it. You should be able to appreciate them, and ask yourself why they appear like this, why they appear like that, what is the purpose of this zigzag, what is the purposes of that curve, etc. All right, so we can spend less time on this lecture on Friday.